Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Leviathan Falls. This is the 9th and final book in the Expanse series, and this is my review for the novel. So I'll have to start with a spoiler warning, of course, for this book, Leviathan Falls. If you have not read the entire thing, if you have not finished the book, then you will not want to watch this video because this video will be full of spoilers, spoiler talk here, so you should have finished the entire book before watching this video. Otherwise, things will be spoiled for you, and you do not want to be spoiled. Anyway, so so this is the final book in the Expanse series, the book that brings the Expanse to a close, and we get to see the actual conclusion to the story after all these years. Now, my first thought when reading this book is that I expected it to have more of an epic feeling to it than it did. It seemed very, I want to say, kind of a lot more personal, or maybe more isolated, more of a I almost want to say claustrophobic kind of story, focusing on just a few characters, kind of like the earlier novels, particularly the first one, Leviathan Wakes. And perhaps that was done intentionally, because I do know that there is a real strong sense of symmetry to this book, and I know that they tried to tie this book into the first book a lot, and there's a lot of recalls, particularly with the ending, and so the title is very appropriate, Leviathan Falls, which is directly references Leviathan Wakes. So Leviathan Wakes is basically, the story of the protomolecule is starting. Like, this is when the Leviathan could be the huge change in humanity discovery, which is the discovery of the ring gates, which begins with the discovery of the protomolecule. So it's when it wakes, and this is the ending, the conclusion of the story of them having the ring gates. So this is when the Leviathan falls. So very aptly named title. That's extremely appropriate. But yeah, what I thought when I read this book, because I knew this was going to be the final book, I was expecting it to have more of a grand, sort of epic world, universe hopping, world hopping feel to it. Kind of like, I would say, Tiamat's Wrath, the previous book, had this feeling. And so I was expecting it to be even grander, but instead they kind of shrunk it down and made it more of an isolated feel to it, which I think a lot of people weren't expecting, because when I went online and I read some other opinions of people who read the books, and they all had the same impression of I did, that they were expecting something more epic. Now, several reviews or opinions I read saw this as a very negative thing, and so they didn't, even though they liked the book, they didn't think it was as great as the previous book, and maybe not the best ending that the series could have had, because they felt disappointed by it not having that grand epic feel. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like I don't agree with that. I feel, for me, I still love this book. Now, I had to sit with it, of course, for a while before I decide if this is one of my favorite books or which one I like better. I still feel like Abaddon's Gate is still my favorite book in this series, and Tiamat's Wrath is probably a close second, and then Babylon's Ashes would be the third, and I don't know, and then Caliban's War is probably the fourth, and then Leviathan Wakes is the fifth, and then now I'm ranking them all. And what am I forgetting? The sixth is Nemesis Games, and then the seventh would be Persepolis Rising, and then the eighth is Cibola Burn. which is still my least favorite. And I don't know where the Leviathan Falls fits in that yet. I think I would have to sit with it, but I think it definitely would sit somewhere in that top 4. Squeeze it somewhere in between Abaddon's Gate, Tiamat's Wrath. God, what did I say? The third one is Babylon's Ashes, and Caliban's Wars. Somewhere in there. Where exactly? I'm not sure. I have to think about it. But I would definitely say it's a good ending. I'm very satisfied. I wasn't disappointed. I would say I was more of off-put by the lack of the epic feel, which is what I was expecting. And maybe I was disappointed at first, but when I think the ending comes together so well, by the time I got to the end of the book, I wasn't worried about it anymore. As I could understand why they wanted to do a more sort of isolated feel, and I actually felt it really worked for the book and for the ending of the Expanse series as a whole. And I think the ending was perfect, really. So I was very happy with this book as a conclusion to the series. Whether or not I would put it in say it's my favorite book, I kind of doubt it. I think I probably always love Abaddon's Gate as my favorite, and I think Tiamat's Wrath is probably better. But whether or not I like this better than Babylon's Ashes or Caliban's Wars, I think I probably would, to be honest. But again, as I said, I have to sit with it a bit. And mainly just because of that ending. Because I think the ending was really had a beautiful symmetry to it for me. And I know the beginning of the book, the bulk of the book does seem a bit like they're shrinking the scope of the story as compared especially to the previous book. But it's still it really explains everything in a satisfying way. Some people, if they think of stuff like Lost, the show Lost, where everyone was completely unsatisfied with the answers given because they were being way too vague and metaphorical. Oh, this is open up to interpretation, it was just bad writing. They just didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't explain enough, and things didn't connect, and the audience realized that by the time we got to the end, that this wasn't structured very well and it wasn't planned out for. Whereas the Expanse series doesn't explain everything fully, but I think it's perfect. I think this is what the writers of Lost pretended or thought that they were doing, but they actually didn't accomplish. I think is actually accomplished here, where it is vague on purpose and not everything's explained on perfect, and it works that way. In fact, I would say if they did explain things more, it wouldn't have worked. Because they explained enough of the story to make the story work. What was relevant to the characters of the story, what was relevant to the main thrust of the story, and you didn't really need more. More would have been superfluous information. So particularly the big mystery that was looming throughout the series, it wasn't really answered until the previous book, Tiamat's Wrath. And Tiamat's Wrath pretty much answered the bulk of the questions involving the alien element, the protomolecule, and their creators, and who wiped out their creators. But this book just expanded upon that more. I feel like that we were already given the answers in the previous book, but this is sort of clarifies and gives you a bit more information. But it doesn't need to fully explain it. For example, we never learn anything about the aliens that destroyed the protomolecule creators and why they're trying to... Well, we know why they're trying to kill humanity, but we don't know who they are. What they look like or what their universe is like. All they are is just a vague concept of beings from another universe that are trying to push back against this protomolecule technology because it is directly hurting their universe. Which is a familiar concept used in sci-fi before, but I think it's used very well here. Now, they explain things a bit more, because we know that, for at least for me, this book made it really more clear that the ring space, that they've been using doesn't exist in our universe. It kind of exists outside the universe, which I hadn't been aware of that before. And that it draws energy from this other universe that these beings live in, which is why they are angry about it, because it's basically killing them. And so they're fighting back against it, which is why they killed the protomolecule creators, which the protomolecule creators were a hive mind type being. But they were defenseless. They couldn't fight back against these aliens. They tried, as we explored in the Holden's visions that he had in Abaddon's Gate, about destroying whole solar systems, like they're colorizing a wound, which makes a lot more sense now. If they're a hive mind, it kind of feels like, all the beings that live in all these different solar systems are all just like body parts, basically, of the same whole. And so that makes a lot more sense that they would, destroying a solar system to them is just like colorizing a wound, or maybe even cutting off a limb to prevent a disease from spreading. And so, but they were defenseless against these aliens that were fighting back because their technology was damaging their universe. And so after they killed the protomolecule creators, then they were fine, everything went back to normal, until humanity stumbled across this technology and they started using it, and the more they started using it, the more it started hurting their universe, so the more they started fighting back again. And after what I believe 30, 40 years of using this technology, they were in full force, and it was really hurting them again, so they were ready to wipe out humanity because humanity was using this technology that was hurting them. So I think that is as good of an explanation as we need. I don't think we need more than that. We don't need to know what these aliens look like, what the universe is like, any of that sort of thing, or what the protomolecule creators looked like, or what their society was like. We know that they were hive mind. That's basically all we need to know. Or how long or any more details than that. Because I think that's all that's relevant to the story. And I think it's actually perfect to leave the rest up to the imagination. I think, for me personally, like, the one thing I maybe would have liked, and I can use this as just my interpretation, my imagination, my sort of headcanon of who the creatures from the other universe were, because, and especially in the final couple chapters, Holden sort of describes them as these dark, angry, powerful beings. So I think of like stuff like the xenomorph from Aliens, or something like really monstery and monstrous and very something very scary. But I think it would have been perfect. Like, my headcanon is that they're like just people, almost looking like humans. Now I'm getting like Star Trek like, but that they're just, or maybe they could be like these cute furry things. But there's something that looks very innocent, and they're actually intelligent, artistic, creative, complex beings who are actively being killed by this protomolecule technology. So I would have loved to see like a chapter where they're like these lovely, loving, creative beings, and all of a sudden they're all getting killed off, and it's like this huge disaster. It's like, so we're almost, or at least the protomolecule technology is like the aliens. They're like the monsters to them. that are killing and hurting them, and so on the last plea of hope and desperation to save themselves and save their species, they come up with a weapon to fight back against these monsters killing them. And it is, in fact, from humanity's perspective, the monsters trying to kill them. That's just my headcanon. That's how but I don't begrudge them for not clarifying that. I actually think it's better that this is just something I can imagine, and then other readers can imagine their own different interpretations of what these aliens are. I actually think that is perfect, but that's just sort of my headcanon of how I would imagine it, because it's kind of, and I think it goes along with the themes of the Expanse, that that things aren't really what they seem, what monsters would appear to be monsters are actually just people trying to do the best for themselves. But anyway, yeah. So that's just my headcanon, but I thought that the way that the books described it was perfect. Now, if we get into what each, I talked about this in pretty much every time I do a review of a book, an Expanse book, that each book sort of has its own genre that is tapping into. Book 1 was a detective story. Book 2 was a political thriller. Book 3 was a haunted house. I mean, that's what the authors say. I still honestly don't really see it much as a haunted house. I mean, I kind of see it. But anyway, book 3 was a haunted house. Book 4 was a Western, very clearly. Book 5, they never clarified on Book 5, but that's kind of God, I can't remember what I came up with for Book 5, but it's kind of like a disaster, movie, yeah, that's how I would say it. And then Book 6 is a war, straight up like a war story. Book 7 is a POW, like prisoner of war, like prison break. That's how I would describe it. It's a prison break genre. Book 8 was like a rebellion. So kind of different than straight up war. Like Book 6 is more like a rebellion, Star Wars-esque, revolutionary type story. And then Book 9, I would say that this is a fugitives on the run type story. For the most of the novel, I think that's the feeling it had, that the Rosinante crew and Teresa were basically on the run and constantly being chased. It's a cat and mouse. Actually, that's the better genre to say. It's a cat and mouse story where Tanaka is the cat hunting after the Rosinante mouse. And I think that's what some people found disappointing, like going from Book 8, which was the big, Star Wars epic rebellion versus the evil empire story, and then down to a cat and mouse, people running away from a chaser, which is not really what they expected. And as I said, I felt that disappointment at first too, but then the more I read, the more I realized, and it's actually, I think they couldn't do another epic, rebellion versus evil empire. I think if they kept that same feel for the final book, then it wouldn't first of all, it wouldn't distinguish it from the previous one, like every book in the series has been distinguished from the other books. But also, I think it actually maybe wouldn't have been as satisfying, because it would have kind of felt like more of the same. And it was interesting that they did go pull it in a different direction, even though this was much smaller in scale. I think where it led, as I said, how they ended it was perfect. So let me talk a bit about the Viewpoint characters. This is something I also touched on in many of my reviews, because from Book 2 all the way up to Book 5, they followed the same format of having 4 Viewpoint characters. Usually they were all separate, and then 2 would come together, and then the other 2 would come together, and then by the end of the novel all 4 would come together. But of course, they broke this format with book 6, 7, and 8. Where they did book 6 was pretty much a free for all. I mean, they did have certain characters that they followed more than others, but it was pretty much we had tons of different Viewpoint chapters. Book 7 started with that format of 4 Viewpoint characters, but then towards the end it started shattering out. Where this novel is pretty much the same as book 8, where there are 4 main characters that we follow most of the time, but they also veer off into other characters whenever it's necessary, whenever they feel like, which is probably my favorite version of this format, to be honest. So I'm glad they did this again for the final book. So, so the main 4 characters that we follow in Leviathan Falls is Holden, which they changed to Jim instead of, like, in all the previous novels the chapter said Holden, now it says Jim, which is an interesting choice. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just making it more personal rather than being more formal, I suppose. And then Tanaka was the other main one, the villain, the hunter, the cat in this cat and mouse story. And then Naomi, which actually I didn't realize as I was reading this, but when I went back and tallied up how many chapters everyone had, Naomi actually had the third most chapters after Jim and Tanaka. I didn't even realize that at the time. And then the 4th one is Elvie. Now, I've mentioned again in all my previous novels that reviews that there's always a chapter from each book that I think is the weak point of the story, where every time we go back to those chapters, I'm like, oh, not these again. I kind of want to skip through that. But so, like, in book 2, it was Prax. In book 3, it was Anna. In book 4, it was Elvie. In book 5, it was, I think, Alex. And in book 6, trying to remember Prax again, even though he wasn't one of the main ones, but book 6 didn't really have any main ones. And then book 7, it was Drummer, because I just found her story depressing. And in book 8, it was definitely Naomi, which I found kind of boring, her story in book 8. But book 9 didn't have any. Like, out of the main 4, I didn't find any of them weak. Every time we went back to one of them, I wasn't like, oh, not this one again. I mean, maybe a little bit I was like that with Elvie, a little bit towards the beginning, but then her story got really interesting. So, not really. So, I overall liked Jim and Naomi. That was an interesting choice, though, because they were together for the entire novel, basically. I mean, they split off every once in a while, but we had 2 Viewpoint characters following the same story, which is different because usually every Viewpoint character is like in a different plot or a different part of the solar system, and maybe towards the end of the book they come together with other characters, but they start out being separated and different, but here they're together the entire time, which is interesting. And Tanaka, I found her stuff really interesting too. She made a really good villain. So the only weak chapters, because the other characters we had chapters were Kit, Alex's son, and then Fayez had a chapter, Teresa had 3 chapters, Jillian had a chapter, and Alex, I think, had a couple chapters. And of course we also had the prologue and the epilogue, and there's a weird chapter which I'm going to get to talk about more shortly. And then there was the interludes with the dreamers. Now the interludes, that was by far my least favorite chapters. I don't really care for that. It's similar to what they did with the interludes in book 4, where it reaches out. Where here it was the dreamer dreams, and the dreamer sees the dreams, and the dreams are dreams of dreams. It's like it's trying to be poetic, having like this poetic way of discerning information, which maybe I'm just not into poetry myself, because I just find it confusing and I don't really get what's going on. Now the dreamers described when basically was Kara for most of the story, although Amos joined later in the story, so it was a combination of the two, where they would do these experiments with it. At first they would dive into this library to try to get more information, and then later they would go into the ring space, the station at the ring space itself, to try to confront Duarte. And for the most part, I found these like unnecessary, or they didn't really push the story forward that much. I suppose they did a little bit, but I feel like you could have cut these out and not really lost that much. You could have found other ways to get the information that was gotten through these interludes, and I just saw that was my least favorite part of the book. Also, the Kit chapters, Alex's son, I found those incredibly boring. And to be honest, there was one stage in the middle of the book where the Holden and Tanaka stuff was like really suspenseful and exciting, and then we cut to a Kit chapter. I skipped it. I went back and read it later once I was finished with the Naomi, with the Tanaka and Naomi and Jim stuff. But because that's when they were like confronted and they were destroying the Tanaka went on board the Draper station, was just killing everyone, and it was like really suspenseful, and it looked like Holden was trapped. And then, here's Kit. What the fuck I care about Kit for? I don't care. So I skipped it, and then later on I went back and read it after I finished that suspenseful bit of the story. Now, the unique chapter that they had in here was the lighthouse and the keeper, which was a long chapter that didn't follow one character. So it broke the convention of each chapter followed a Viewpoint character. We hear if it just switched back and forth between multiple Viewpoint characters, which at first I found a bit confusing, but in the end I actually thought it was quite brilliant. And of course it described the whole concept of the lighthouse and the keeper, that is that Duarte was acting as a sort of a defense against these aliens trying to wipe out humanity, and that he was able to not only fight back against them, but save some of the people that these aliens were trying to kill. And so this chapter sort of described all the events that were happening, and of course Duarte at first introduced Duarte's attempts to create a hive mind out of humanity, make humanity become a hive mind, which would drive the rest of the novel. So yeah, I thought that was really creative, and I did enjoy that chapter a lot. And of course, we also had a prologue that had Admiral Trejo as a Viewpoint character, and then the epilogue that had the linguist, which I love that epilogue. I thought it was a perfect way to end the story, but again, I'll get into that a bit more. So let me get more into Tanaka. Because I felt like, she was a really interesting, well drawn out character. See, they've had various villains throughout the Expanse series. There was Aaron Wright, there was Murtry, there was Ashford, and in most of those cases, and then there's also Marco. But especially in the first three cases, Aaron Wright, who barely appeared in the novels, he's mainly the show fleshed him out a hell of a lot more. So he was barely even. It was probably more like you would say Admiral Wynn was more of the villain of the book two. But regardless, even though like Aaron Wright was the power behind him. But anyway, with all those villains, be they Aaron Wright, Admiral Wynn, Murtry, or Ashford in book three, they weren't Viewpoint characters, so they were more of, and in fact Ty Frank described Ashford this way in particular, they were more of a narrative function than they were a character. They were something to push the narrative story forward, which is fine because you have that in novels where you have characters who are not Viewpoint chapters. I'm thinking of in the Song of Ice and Fire novels, there's Robb Stark, who in the books was in the show was a really fleshed out main character, but in the books he was never a Viewpoint character, so he was just a function to push the story forward. And typically that's what the villains of the Expanse have been, particularly with Murtry, Ashford, and Wynn, and Ehrenreich. And so there's nothing wrong with that, but they weren't really fully fleshed out, fully realized villains. Now, Marco Inaros in book 5 and 6 was mostly that, although I think we did get a couple of Viewpoint chapters with him in book 6, and we definitely got a couple of Philip, which also fleshed out Marco more. So he was a bit more explored than the other villains. But then, of course, book 7 introduced us to, I can't even remember his name, but the main Laconian guy who took over Medina Station. He had a Viewpoint chapter, so that's the first time we really got Viewpoint chapters from a villain. But I didn't really like that character that much, to be honest, and I didn't really find him all that interesting, even though we were getting his perspective. So I think this is the first time with Viewpoint chapters from Tanaka, who was, in my opinion, a much better villain than, I think, Santiago, whatever his name was, who was in book 7. This is the first time we got like a really, really fleshed out, dynamic villain. Because as much as I loved Murtry in book 4 and Ashford in book 3, they were just plot points. They were not fully fleshed out. So in this book we have Tanaka, who is definitely a very fully fleshed out, and I feel like she's a lot more of an interesting character than let's call him Santiago, even though I might be wrong. Because she's they really get into her mindset about, and her backstory about how she was raised, how she lost her parents, and had I would say an abusive aunt who raised her to be very rigid, and how she's like takes pleasure in her personal sexual life. She likes to men who are lower ranked that she can dominate and intimidate, and she had this like really twisted mindset that made total sense once the way her character was described in these Viewpoint chapters, that she would have this really messed up way of looking at the world, and it did make her a very scary, dynamic, and interesting villain. So I'm just going to go ahead and say right now that this is the best villain in the Expanse book series. And so that's partly why I say I don't mind the cat and mouse nature of the final book, which is, as I said, a step back or smaller scope than the previous book, which a lot of people were disappointed in. I don't mind that because the cat in this cat and mouse story is such an interesting villain, and the best villain that the show ever came up with, that it made this so much more interesting. And I think it was the most satisfying death of any villain in the Expanse series. In the books, Admiral Wynn kind of went out whimpering, which was ironic. It was funny because he was this big menace that was causing all this death and issues, and then he just at the end just cried and whimpered. And Murtry didn't actually die, nor did Ashford, but Murtry went out kind of like in a typical Western showdown, shoot 'em out thing, which isn't my thing. I'm not that interested in that. And then Marco, his death was interesting too, because he went Dutchman, when it's like, I'm going to conquer and win, and then all of a sudden he's gone. But not really satisfying that much, because he just blinks out. Whereas I really found Tanaka's death so satisfying, that she went out just because the man that she was basically her god, someone that she had served her whole life, who was her emperor, the head of the empire, someone she had unwavering devotion to her entire life to, was now like doing the worst possible thing she could think, because she was such a fleshed out character, but she was such a private and secretive person. The thought of having her mind shared with every human being in the universe was the most horrifying concept that she could possibly think of. And so she didn't give a shit that this man that she thought of before as her god, her emperor, was, because he was the one trying to enforce the absolute worst horror she could possibly think of on her, that she just went apeshit and just ripped him to shreds. That was, and then of course he killed her at the same time. She basically sacrificed herself, not to save humanity, not because she wanted to go out and sacrifice herself to save everyone. And there was no sense of altruism to it whatsoever. It was blatantly just pure, unadulterated rage, which of course it was explained perfectly, makes perfect sense for her character. And so she's just in a sense of pure, unadulterated rage about directed towards this man who was trying to impose the worst horror she could possibly imagine on her. She just went out and ripped him to shreds, not caring about what happened to herself. It was all about taking her anger out on this man and just ripping him to shreds and killing herself in the process. And then of course her final words or final thoughts are to think the one thing she was most pissed off about is that Holden survived her, and how her final actions is to use her fingers and has a gun and say, "Bang, you're dead, motherfucker," to Holden, and then die. Like, that is the perfect death of a villain. So not only do I think this is the best villain in the Expanse series, that was by far the best death of a villain in the Expanse series. So all of that does make me appreciate the cat and mouse nature of the story. And then the next thing in my notes I have to talk about, I labeled Duarte of Borg. Because as a Star Trek fan, now, the concept of having a hive mind alien species is not unique to Star Trek, and it is something that has been done in science fiction a lot, because it is something that it's a natural thing to speculate about, that because when we try to guess at what different aliens will be like, we only have our own experiences on Earth to base those speculations on, and so it makes sense that we would base it on other sort of animals that exist that we are aware of, and we do know from some insects that have like a hive mind type scenario, and it's something that is interesting to speculate that there's an alien species that have a hive mind. But being a Star Trek fan, I could not help but think of that Duarte was basically trying to make the human species the Borg, and it did feel very much like the same kind of threat. The threat that Holden faced against Duarte was very similar with the threat that Jean-Luc Picard faced against the Borg, that we need to keep our individuality intact, and that if we're all become assimilated into a hive mind, then we're not human anymore. And that is something to absolutely be feared. So I couldn't help but think about that. But that was actually really good. And I don't think it was in any way, shape, or form ripping off the Borg. As I said, this is a very general concept of having a hive mind in science fiction. It's just as a Star Trek fan, that is something that my mind went to. But I think it was very effective though in making that a very scary concept that should try to be avoided, and made having that knowledge of the board made the whole what Duarte was trying to do a lot more scary and a lot more sort of apprehension involved in that. Now let me talk about Alex, because it's very weird, because this book came out right before season 6 started. So I was reading the book at the same time I was watching the first episode of season 6 and waiting for future episodes of season 6. And so my mind had issues with that. It was confusing because in the show Alex is dead. And then we get this, and so that's the sort of mindset concept I'm in, where I'm seeing the characters of Amos, Holden, and Naomi dealing with the after effects of Alex's death. And then at the same time I'm reading this book, which takes place way after the events of season 6, and Alex is still very much alive. And in fact, he survives until the end of the book, so he lives, which... it was a bit confusing for my mind to grasp at first, but then I just had to, of course, on the conscious level, I was aware of the difference. Like, one's book, one's novel, one's a show. They're two different stories, but on the subconscious level, it was a bit jarring. But eventually I got there. And it is interesting that it does make me wonder if they do ever adapt this into a show, how they'll have to change a lot of things because Alex is kind of integral to the story. But I loved his ending. I thought it was a great character journey for him, a great way to end his story, that he would choose to, when he was stuck with the choice of where to spend the rest of his life, and he would be stuck there, that he chose to be with his son instead of to be with his adoptive family of the Rocinante. I thought that was a perfect ending for him. I thought it was a great character journey. Maybe it's something he would regret in future life, but as he said, even he thought to himself, like, he's old at this stage and he doesn't have that many years left to him, and so that he would rather spend it with seeing his grandson and his son and how they lived out. It was very touching, and I really felt that worked as well. Now, there was also the downfall of the rebellion, and this is, again, I'm getting back to, I think, why some people were disappointed in this book, because book 8 especially ended on a very high note of for the rebellion. Now, and when I first did my review for Tiamat's Wrath, I described that book as the Empire Strikes Back of this. If you think of books 7, 8, 9 as a trilogy, that was very much the Empire Strikes Back of that trilogy. I know that's a overused cliche, but I think it's actually appropriate, and I still stand by that, because that was sort of, most people would point to that as the high point of the trilogy and the epicness of it, and really just how exciting it was. But in terms of theme, this book was actually more like Empire Strikes Back, because the theme of Empire Strikes Back was the bad guys win, the Empire prevails, and all this hope that we had in, sorry to use that word, but all this hope that we had in A New Hope was, dashed, and it was like, no, this Empire is going to come back and kill the shit out of you, which that actually happened in this book. So in some ways, this is the Empire Strikes Back. But I still think, I would still refer to Tiamat's Wrath as more of the Empire Strikes Back as a trilogy, because that was the second powerful chapter that was really making things exciting and laying the groundwork. Whereas it followed a different structure, because in the Empire Strikes Back, that's when the heroes were at their most low, they were defeated, and then in the third one they came back. Whereas here, the Tiamat's Wrath was ended with the heroes at their highest, where they were most triumphant, and it looked like they were had a fighting chance to take on this empire. And then this book comes along and they just spiral downwards and then collapse. And it's towards the end that they reach a different ending that is where they're triumphant, but it's in a different in a different way than basically just the rebellion defeating the Empire. Because in this book, halfway through, the Empire won. Basically, they defeated the rebellion. Now, they did end up making a truce, and Naomi accepted this truce between the Laconian Empire and the rebellion. But if things continued as normal and the Ringate continued as normal, then Laconian would have, once the crisis was over, they would have just simply betrayed Naomi this truce and won, basically. So it was just a temporary truce in terms of the current crisis, which is why I think Naomi took it, because she recognized that this current crisis is something that they needed to overcome first, and that they couldn't worry about what came next, because there would be no next if they didn't get out of this crisis. But I think she knew, from the get-go, which is why they didn't take the truce at first, that Laconia would not honor it. They're smart enough to know that. In fact, we get that in one of Tanaka's chapters that Trejo outright says, oh yeah, she can be this symbol head and thinks she has this power, but, eventually we will have the ultimate power and whatever. And of course, Naomi's not that naive, but eventually does take the truce because that's our only option. As I said, that current crisis was more important than worrying about what came next. So, yes, essentially, the Empire won. But the heroes end up prevailing in a different way rather than through the rebellion. And I think, as I said, I think that some people would find that disappointing, because Book 8 ended on a high note for the rebellion, where it looks like it was setting up for the rebellion to win, but they in fact lost. But I think is I'm not disappointed in that, really, because I think the point of this series, even the final 3 books, was beyond simply rebellion versus evil empire, which, as I said, was mainly the focus of Book 8 and a lot of focus of the earlier part of this book as well. But it went beyond that, and that's not really what the overall theme of the entire Expanse series has been about. It's more been about the Leviathan, the protomolecule and its technology, and what that means for humanity. And that is what was resolved in the end. And by that story being resolved, it actually made the Rebellion versus Empire story moot. It made it irrelevant, so it's no longer existed or mattered by the end of it, because every solar system was isolated, so there could be no empire. And since there's no empire, there's nothing to rebel against. So yeah, and I thought that was a very interesting and unique way to end that story. So yeah. But I think the was definitely the high point and the best thing about this novel, and looking back as a series as a whole, is Holden's character journey, which I do think has always been at the center of particularly the novels. And I think the way that played out was absolutely perfect. I love the moment where Holden injects himself with protomolecule, because, especially thinking of earlier books, Book 2 in particular, the trauma that he suffered over the protomolecule, and just how all the PTSD he was suffering because of that, and just how he was mortified of the protomolecule, anything having to do with it, which is why in book 2 he just wanted to wipe it out, get rid of it, and he didn't want anyone to use it, and it was just a terrifying thing for him, and he wanted nothing to do with. And so that's what made it so powerful when he purposely chose to put it in his own body, meaning it would be his death. It really shows how far his character has grown since that time, and it really encapsulates his character journey. And of course, it brings back the apparition of Miller, which I'm not sure how Holden knew that just simply injecting protomolecule into his body would do that. Now, I'm still a bit iffy that it actually works out that way, but it works for the story, so who cares? But it's so great. It was so great having Miller there for the final moments. And of course, there is a lot of symmetry between the ending of this book and the ending of the first book. And they do even reference it a lot, saying how the way that Duarte is connected to the protomolecule is very similar to the way that Julie was connected. In fact, they use a similar method that Miller used to find Julie in book 1. They use it in order to find Duarte in this book. And then Holden, once Tanaka takes care of Duarte, Holden essentially becomes the new Julie and connects to the protomolecule, which again is like something that would have mortified him and terrified him beyond belief, and yet this is how he chooses to end his life. And I think it's also the perfect character journey for him, that he sacrifices himself to save all of humanity. And of course, Miller flat out points out the irony of it, of how, and he used to be known about sharing information about, he was very much against egotistical dictators unilaterally making decisions for all of humanity. He felt that humanity should be given the information and the people should decide what to do, rather than it be controlled by one person. And yet in this moment, he alone unilaterally makes the ultimate decision for humanity. And I love when Miller is pointing this out. It's like, is there a point to you? Why are you bringing this up? Like, he was... So it's something he wasn't proud of, but it's something that he needed to do. And he through his character journey, through his growth, he was able to do it. Now, because it was an interesting scenario, because he was basically presented with 3 options at this stage in the story. He could have done nothing, in which case these, evil aliens, not evil, as I said, but these aliens, angry aliens, this is a better adjective, angry aliens from another universe would have wiped out all of humanity if he had done nothing. So that's not a very good option. And I do, because I start to wonder, would they just killed the people in the ring space? But now, I think if you think back to book 2, I think they made it clear that they were killing people beyond the ring space. So I think that it was clear that they would have wiped out all of humanity. They wouldn't have stopped, because they would have wanted to wipe out any chance of humanity using these ring gates. So they would have killed all of the human race everywhere. So that was option 1. Obviously, not a good option. Option 2 was to follow Duarte's plan, because that was the only way to actually fight back against the aliens, was to turn humanity into a hive mind, which apparently gave them more power than what the protomolecule creators had, because so they could do what the protomolecule creators never could, and actually fight back and defeat these aliens and prevent them from wiping out humanity. But however, the side effect is they become the Borg. They become a single hive mind, and so they lose absolutely everything that makes them human, and they're not human anymore. What are they? Some weird hive mind where every person is just basically an appendage. And so as was made clear through Tanaka's storyline, this is also a horrific end for the human race, even though technically they would still exist. It's also not an option. It also, by the way, made perfect sense that Duarte would be on board with this plan, since he was always about being this dictator who controlled everything, humanity, in order to save humanity, and so his mindset was perfectly in line with that. Holden's was not. So he realized that was not a good option as well. So the only option left was option 3: destroy the ring space and the ring gates entirely, and thus the aliens would no longer have any need to attack humanity, because the thing that was hurting them, that was destroying their world, their universe, would be gone, and their universe would be left in peace. And even like thinking back to my headcanon about who the aliens are, let's say they're these peaceful, benign beings who are being massacred and killed off because of what humanity's doing at the ring space. That's a happy ending for them, because no longer they're fine now, because the ring space is gone and their universe isn't being damaged anymore. And so that would be, and of course humanity would be saved, and it would not have to turn into a hive mind. But of course, it's not a perfect option either, because it means that all of these different colonies that are spread throughout the galaxy would be in complete and total isolation, cut off from any trade. And in many cases, and Miller did bring this up, a lot of these systems were not self-sustainable, that they were the more newer ones, the more established ones, or the smaller ones could not survive without trade. So Holden was essentially condemning millions, possibly billions of people to a slow, horrible death by doing this. Which some would say was similar to what Dresden did in the book 1. Something that he thought was the most horrific, immoral, unconscionable thing to possibly do. He was now doing it. But, as I said, it was the only option that worked, because his other options were worse. His other options were to let aliens just kill off everyone, and so instead of just billions of dying, it would be absolutely everyone. A lot more. Or they're not human anymore, and they're just hive mind thing, which is not an option either. So the only good option was to sacrifice these people, and then also not only that, but also cut off all these other colonies. The ones that could survive would be independent and cut off from the rest of humanity, so you have little pockets of humanity spread throughout the galaxy in isolation. And I actually love that that's the ending of this series, that's what they were building to. And the authors have confirmed that this was always the plan. And it's funny because they mentioned that, and I can't remember the exact line now, but the final line in the book, before the epilogue, of course, where Naomi says something about how humanity's been cut off, or maybe someday they'll, reach out to each other, whatever. I can't remember the exact line. I should have looked this up, I know, but I'm in a time crunch. But anyway, that was the final line that was always planned. And they said they knew this when they were writing book 2, which that surprised me, because they really had everything planned out that early. Now they confirmed book 1 was mostly based off of a role-playing game, and they said that I think they said 40% of it was created in these role-playing tabletop sessions that they were doing, but they fleshed it out more and turned it into a novel. And they didn't think that the novel would pick up. They didn't know they would do more books, but of course when the novel was a huge success, they decided to do more books. So it makes sense that they weren't thinking about it then. But in book 2, they knew that they were doing a series now, and this would be an ongoing thing. And it's interesting to learn that they had this all planned out all the way back then, because in book 2 was before the ring system was even introduced. So they already knew this concept. They knew that the protomolecule was building towards creating this ring system, or not creating the ring in the Sol system that would connect humanity to the ring space that already exists, and they would reactivate it and use it to colonize 1,300 solar systems. And then so they knew that eventually that would end, and that the whole technology would fall apart, because there was something that killed these aliens that created the system, and that thing that killed them is going to be reactivated and trying to kill them because they're using the same technology. And so the technology would need to go, which would trap all these pockets of humanity throughout the galaxy. And so that's always what they were building towards, and I think that's great. I think that's actually quite brilliant that they were always building towards this ending of having these isolated pockets of humanity. Now, one thing, they constantly say 1,300 world. Oh, we have 1,300 chances. I think Naomi said that in the final chapter. But really, it's not that many. It would probably, I mean, I wonder if it would probably just be like 100, maybe. Because they were never clear, they never gave exact numbers, but I would think, because the ring system was only active for around 40 years or so, which it seems like a long time. That's all, that's half a human life, if in a lot of cases more than half a lifespan. And so you think that's a long time, but it's not really in the grand scheme of things of establishing all these colonies. 40 years is not that long at all. So I do wonder how many systems that there were self-sustaining colonies that could survive this cutoff actually existed at this point in time. Like, my guess would be 100 at the most, not 1,300. First of all, I don't think they would have been able to colonize all 1,300 because, for one thing, they didn't have enough time, and for two, many of these worlds probably were not habitable to humanity or viable for colonies. So it was probably less than that was viable, and then even less than that they actually had time to get around to. So I would guess, I would say 100 is a high estimate. So I would say 100 at the most is what the pockets of humanity that existed after Holden cut it off. But still, it's interesting to speculate that these little pockets are in complete isolation, and they're going to develop in many different ways. And so that brings us to the epilogue, the linguist, which takes place a millennium, basically 1,000 years in the future, where one of these pockets of humanity finally makes contact with Earth. And I was so blown away that Amos was still there. Like, that was a cool way that Amos has survived over 1,000 years, that he's basically the Highlander of humanity now, and is kind of like in a leading position too, because he's been around for so long. Also reminds me of Odo in that episode Children of Time, but then again, this is a Star Trek geek. But so that was a really cool way to end the story. But if I'm going to do like a practical nitpick here, and I know not everyone's going to agree with this nitpick, but I kind of feel very strongly about this, is that because before I read that epilogue and I knew this concept of having all these pockets of humanity, my first thought was they're going to communicate with each other. And so in the epilogue, though, they knew nothing about each other until they physically went there, which I actually think is impractical. I think it's more practical that they would be able to set up some sort of communications first before they could actually physically go to other places. And this scenario presented like this hibernation technology, and also more sophisticated drive system that they use, which I can't remember the details of. But still, I think they would be. It's easier to invent and come up with long distance communications first before actually physically being there. And they could actually send like unmanned drones would be able to get there first that they could use possibly for communication. And I would imagine a scenario where they slowly start to build up this interconnected, like over 1,000 years or whatever, they slowly start to build up this interconnected communication system where they're starting to communicate with all these different pockets of humanity so they can learn about them and know what each one is like before they actually are able to physically go there. But of course, that wouldn't make as interesting as a prologue, would it? It's much more interesting if you have a linguist actually arrive at Earth and talk to Amos Burton. So I get it. I understand why they went that way. But in terms of practicality, I actually think the communication route would have made more sense to me, but I still think it's a perfect way to end the series. So when I look back at the series as a whole, I think this is a really, like, the entire 9 books is a really unique, perfectly structured series, because it begins with the story of this proto-molecule being discovered, this weird ancient alien technology. And gradually, over the course of the 9 books, the ancient alien technology opens up to allowing humanity to colonize all these different worlds throughout the galaxy that was far beyond their reach, but a natural means that humanity could come up with. But then the story ends with this technology coming to an end where it wasn't viable and is destroyed, and thus you have all these isolated pockets of humanity. And the way that the authors put it, and I think they even some of the characters touched on this in the final chapters, is that it's not 1,300, because there's not going to be that many, but there's a lot more chances for humanity to get things right, because you got isolated pockets of humanity. Humanity keeps making the same mistakes over and over again, and this is something that the authors talked about themselves. Is that it's very antithetical to the Star Trek mentality that humanity is constantly improving and its emotion is going to get better, and eventually we're going to create this perfect utopian society because we keep evolving and getting better, whereas the Expanse creators have a much more cynical view that humanity keeps repeating history and making the same mistakes over and over and over and over and over again, which is, I guess, also the Battlestar Galactica way of looking things, that we just keep repeating and repeating events and not learning, which, based off of modern era and how things are going, that really seems to be true. I mean, we're advancing in terms of technology, but in terms of society and becoming, or any objective sense of morality, which I don't think it really exists, but that's another topic. But any sort of somewhat objective sense of morality, humanity hasn't really improved at all. They're just doing the same things over and over and over again. And so that's basically what the story of the Expanse has been, where technology has moved forward and they've colonized the solar system, but there's society-wise, they're doing the same mistakes over and over again. They oppress the people in the belt the same way colonizers oppressed native people on Earth. And there's been war and conflict and fighting over resources the same way as always been throughout humanity's history. So that's sort of mentality of the creators of the Expanse, and what the story of the Expanse is saying is that we just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. However, they presented a scenario here, because there's all these different isolated pockets of humanity throughout the galaxy. Now, maybe at least one of them might get it right. and so the culture that the linguist comes from is representing that more Star Trek mentality, of this one culture got it right and is going to make contact with these other pockets of humanity to try to show them how to get it right too. So it ends on a really strong element of hope overall, even though it takes over 1,000 years to get there, which I think is a lot more realistic timeline than Star Trek, by the way. Star Trek's timeline is the most unrealistic timeline ever. That would become this perfect society by the 23rd century? No way. But, but it does end on this, finally ending on this note of hope, but something that is totally in line with the mentality that the series has had. More cynical line, but it ends on something that's hopeful. And that's why it's a perfect ending. And that's why I actually love this book. And the more I think about it, the more I might think this is my second or third favorite book. But yeah, maybe even I'll say this is my favorite book when it comes to the end, but I don't know. See, the thing is, as much as I love the ending, something like Abaddon's Gate, which is why it's still my favorite book, was so exciting and intense throughout the entire book. Like, I remember being so enthralled. Whereas with this book, once we got to the point where the Gathering Storm was destroyed, like, that was exciting. I was really invested. But then after that kind of dulled down, I wasn't as, like, intense and I wasn't as invested. I was still interested. And it, as I said, the ending was extremely satisfying, but it didn't have that immersion that I felt when reading something like Abaddon's Gate or Tiamat's Wrath. So I think this is going to be my third favorite. Maybe even my fourth behind Babylon's Ashes. It's been a while since I read that book too. I have to go back and read that. But yeah, we'll see. But I did love the ending. A lot, and I did think it was the perfect ending for The Expanse. So my rating for Leviathan Falls out of 10 is going to be a 9. Excellent. Yeah, so I wasn't as disappointed with this book as a few other people I've read have been, but at the same time I didn't think that this, I think it could have been better, but that ending was perfect. The ending was just perfect, and so that makes me appreciate the book a lot more. So that's it for my review of Leviathan Falls. Thank you so much for watching, and I guess this concludes my coverage of the Expanse novels. However, not really, because next March they're going to release a collection of all of the short stories, most of which I have not read. I've only read 2, Strange Dogs and The Gods of Risk, which Gods of Risk was kind of dull. Like, I didn't think it was that good. Strange Dogs, which I had finally finished just a couple days ago, because I started reading it like years ago when it first came out, and I thought, oh, this is boring, and I put it down and I never finished it. But then, of course, when season 6 came out and they're doing that adaptation about it, I was like, oh, I should go back and finish it. And of course, I know how it ends because they spoiled that in Tiamat's Wrath, which I felt a bit lost in Tiamat's Wrath because I didn't really catch the references that they were going for. But I finally went back and read Strange Dogs, and goddamn, that short story is amazing. It's extremely dark, but extremely powerful. So I'm very much anticipating this anthology release of all the short stories, which will include a new short story that takes place before the epilogue of Leviathan Falls, but after the final chapter. So I'm very interested to see where they're going to go with that. So I will be back to review that collection of short stories. So I've only read 2 of them, but I'll go through all the different short stories in that review. But it is interesting that they could possibly continue the story because there's all these different pockets of humanity. But the authors flat out said that other than the short story that's coming out with the collection, that they're done with the Expanse. Like, we're done with the Expanse. We told the story that we want to tell. It has a finite conclusion. We don't need to revisit this world. Which I can see that, and I believe them. I take them at their word. But, there is so much opportunity because there's so many different of these pockets of humanity that you could explore. And then, of course, you could explore the era after the linguist visits Amos. However, stories require attention, and we're meant to believe that this is a perfect ending, so that would kind of undermine that. But still, you could even go before that moment and visit some of these different pockets of humanity and how it affects them. And so there's a lot of storytelling opportunities there. So I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that 5, 10, 15 years from now, the authors change their mind and be like, actually, I kind of want to revisit that. I'm certain it's not going to happen anytime soon because I believe them when they say we're done with the Expanse. I believe that's how they feel now. Especially after writing 9 books and having worked on this TV show for such a long time that they've been so overwhelmed with the Expanse they kind of need a break from it, and they think, no, this is the perfect ending, we're done. But people change their minds. Much like Orson Scott Card with when he wrote the Ender series, like he did the Ender's Game and then the Speaker of the Dead series, and it's like, okay, the series is done. When he finished that series is over with, I'm finished with Ender's Game. And then like 10 years later, created another Ender's Game series with Ender's Shadows. So, I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that maybe 10 years or so from now that we see another Expanse spin-off series taking place in one of these pockets of humanity. I wouldn't rule it out personally, but anyway, I was supposed to end this review. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel if you're watching, of course, the Expanse Season 6. I cover that every week, reviewing every episode and then doing a live discussion with various other YouTubers on each episode. So be sure to check me out for that. Also check out my channel for many more videos and other shows like all things Star Trek, Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.